The laughter came first, quick, sharp, and just a little too eager. On the sun-baked tarmac of a combat aviation brigade, Captain Miller's voice cut across the assembled pilots like a blade. With all due respect, Warrant Officer Hayes, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. This isn't a flight school for rookies. We need experience in that cockpit, not just a certificate and 1,000 flight hours scribbled in your logbook. A ripple of nervous chuckles followed the kind of laughter men give, not because something is funny, but because they're aligning themselves with authority. Miller didn't laugh with them. He didn't need to. Their reaction was his validation. The target of his scorn stood quietly beside the massive Chinook helicopter, her helmet tucked at her side. Warrant Officer Rachel Hayes looked impossibly young in her sage green flight suit, her frame slender, her hair pulled back in a severe, disciplined bun. There was no makeup on her face, no attempt to impress, just a quiet, unreadable calm. She didn't flinch. She didn't scowl. She offered no defense. Her silence was a void, stark, unsettling in its composure. The other pilots shifted uneasily. They were used to seeing loud voices dominate. They expected protest, a comeback, maybe even a flash of anger. Instead, they got nothing but quiet. And that silence carried a weight none of them understood. Not far away from the shade of the operations building, General Thompson watched the scene unfold. His eyes weathered by decades of combat tours, and command missed nothing. He saw more than a young officer standing still under fire. He saw the perfect centered balance in Hayes' stance, the way she held herself neither at attention nor at ease, but in a posture of coiled readiness. He had seen it before in men and women who carried themselves not with words, but with deeds. Moments like this rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They creep in quietly, disguised as routine. A captain puffing himself up in front of his peers, a group of pilots laughing because they don't know any better, and a young woman standing silent, bearing the insult without reaction. Miller believed he had put her in her place. The others believed they had just witnessed their instructor score another easy victory. The truth was different. Hayes hadn't flinched because there was nothing to flinch from. Every measured gesture, her gaze fixed on the Chinook, shimmering in the heat haze, the calm rhythm of her breathing, the way she brushed dust from her sleeve, wasn't weakness. It was control. She was not there to prove herself with noise. She was there to let her work speak louder than anything Miller could say. Conflict doesn't always begin with a shout. Sometimes it begins with a crooked smile, a sharp word, a ripple of laughter. Sometimes it begins with silence. And when the time came for the brigade to be tested, it would not be Miller's voice the desert listened to. It would be Rachel Hayes' silence. The day's exercise was no ordinary training flight. It was the brigade's most punishing simulation, the high-threat dust-off drill. Designed to push both pilot and machine to the brink, it recreated the nightmare scenario every aviator feared: a catastrophic dual-engine failure in a fully loaded Chinook helicopter. There would be no power to rely on, no engines to save them. The 40-ton bird would become a falling stone, and the only thing standing between the crew and disaster would be the pilot's ability to execute a deadstick autorotation. The objective guide, the powerless giant into a landing zone barely larger than its rotor disc, bleed off speed at the last second and put it down alive. Even among seasoned aviators, autorotations in light helicopters were considered difficult. In a Chinook, they bordered on impossible. Most training manuals didn't even bother addressing the maneuver except as a last resort. The test was designed not for success, but for failure, to force pilots to confront their limits. And Captain Miller, emboldened by his earlier mockery, made sure everyone knew where he placed his bets. "She won't make it," he muttered from the control tower, loud enough for the room to hear. 1,000 hours in the logbook isn't enough to wrestle that monster to the ground. Not in this wind. His smirk was confident, cruel, a man certain of his superiority. The simulation began. From the tower, the brigade watched on the monitors as the Chinook lifted gracefully into the sky, its twin rotors pounding the air with brute force. The machine climbed steadily, carrying Hayes and her co-pilot into the vast blue. For half an hour, all was routine. Then came the call, sharp and chilling, over the comms. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, dual engine failure. We are a dead stick." A ripple of tension tore through the tower. Everyone knew what that meant. A Chinook without engines was a glider with the aerodynamics of a brick. The air itself became the enemy, rushing upward against the blades, threatening to rip them into chaos. On the monitors, The co-pilot's face was pale sweat streaking down his temples as he fought the instinct to panic. But beside him, Rachel Hayes was composed, her expression unchanged, her hands steady on the controls. The roaring thunder of engines had vanished, replaced by the hollow, percussive whump, whump, whump of blades turning only on the mercy of rushing air. Every input she made was minimal, precise, adjusting the collective nudging, the cyclic coaxing the pedals. She wasn't fighting the machine. She was guiding it. Where others saw a plummeting giant, she saw potential energy stored in spinning rotors, waiting to be managed. From the tower, Miller leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the console. She's too fast. She'll never make the zone. His voice carried not confidence now, but dread disguised as prediction. The Chinook dropped like a stone. Ground crews scattered, craning their necks, bracing for impact. Dust plumed in spirals as the bird drew closer. To every eye, it looked like catastrophe was seconds away. And then, at the last possible moment, Hayes pulled. The nose flared with surgical precision, bleeding off speed in a single, perfectly timed motion. The descent rate collapsed, and the massive helicopter settled onto the dirt patch, not with a crash, but with a gentle kiss of its wheels. Dead center, perfectly aligned on the marker. For a moment, the world was silent. Then came the sound of disbelief, gasps, muttered curses, the shuffling of boots. In the tower, Miller sank back into his chair, his smirk shattered into disbelief. "No," he whispered. "That's not possible." The silence that followed was heavier than the landing itself. Even the tower's radios seemed reluctant to break it. Mechanics on the tarmac stared at the giant machine, its blades slowing to a lazy spin, as if trying to comprehend that they had just watched the impossible. Hayes moved with the same economy she had shown in the cockpit. She shut down systems, logged the landing, and pulled off her helmet with calm deliberation. To her, it was just another flight. To everyone else, it was a miracle. In the control tower, Miller tried to find words, but none came. His authority, once so booming, now seemed paper-thin. Every insult he had hurled hours earlier echoed back at him, hollow and shameful. Down on the tarmac, General Thompson approached. He had watched every moment without expression, but now he walked with the deliberate pace of a man who understood the gravity of what had just been done. Hayes snapped to attention as he reached her, her arm raised in salute. But Thompson did not return it. Instead, he studied her silently for a long moment, then asked for the roster. When Miller, pale and shaken, handed it over, the general read her name aloud, Hayes Rachel. "Warrant Officer 1. He closed the clipboard with a snap. "So it is you." The words sent murmurs through the crowd. Thompson's voice rose steady and commanding. "Do you know who just saved that crew? Do you even understand what you just witnessed?" No one spoke. The general let the silence hang, then continued. "This sanitized file you've seen this 1,000 hours logged isn't the truth. Warrant Officer Rachel Hayes is no novice. She is a veteran of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. Her call sign is Specter." The word alone seemed to change the air. For some, it meant nothing. But for those who knew the veterans, the instructors, the senior staff, it was like hearing a ghost story confirmed. The Night Stalkers were legends, and Specter was among their finest. 5,000 combat hours, Thompson said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. 14 deployments, all classified, autorotations under fire, extractions at night below treetop level, landings in mountain passes with one engine burning. That maneuver you just saw. She performed it in combat with wounded men in the back under enemy fire, and they're alive today because of her. The weight of his words pressed into every heart. The rookies who had laughed earlier now stared in awe. Even Miller seemed to shrink, his arrogance ground into dust beneath the truth. Then in a gesture no one expected, General Thompson removed his cap and offered Hayes a slow, deliberate salute. "Specter," he said quietly, "your reputation precedes you. It is an honor." Hayes returned the salute with the same quiet calm she had carried all day. She needed no words. Her silence was stronger than anything she could have spoken. The story spread quickly. By nightfall, every corner of the brigade had heard about the impossible landing and the revelation that the rookie was in fact a legend. Mechanics, instructors, and rookies alike began calling that dirt patch Hayes's Perch. It wasn't just a landing zone anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that mastery needs no noise. Captain Miller changed first. His swagger disappeared. One morning, he approached Hayes quietly, his helmet in his hands. "Warrant Officer Hayes," he said, his voice steady but stripped of arrogance. "I was wrong. I judged you by hours, not by skill. Will you teach me?" She didn't gloat. She didn't lecture. She simply nodded. And in that gesture was an invitation not just to Miller, but to the entire brigade to step away from arrogance and embrace humility. Over the following months, the brigade's culture shifted. Loud bravado gave way to deliberate competence. Respect was no longer earned by who shouted the loudest, but by who flew the steadiest. Scores improved, readiness sharpened, but the true transformation was harder to measure. It lived in the quiet moments, before missions, in the unspoken trust, between pilots, in the way men and women began to carry themselves. Hayes's Perch became part of every new aviator's orientation. The story was told not as a boast, but as a warning: never underestimate the quiet professional. The most dangerous weapon on a battlefield is often the one you don't see coming. Rachel Hayes's legacy wasn't carved in stone or etched in a citation. It was written in the hands of the pilots she trained, in the humility she inspired, in the silence that followed acts of impossible precision. For those of us who've worn the uniform, the lesson is timeless. Real authority doesn't shout, it proves. And legacy isn't measured by medals or speeches. It's measured by the standard you leave behind for others to follow. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about the quiet professionals you've known, and if you want more stories where humility outlasts arrogance, subscribe and stay with us. These are the lessons worth passing on.